We're going to talk about user stories today. What's the first thing that pops into your mind when you hear the user story? Anyone?
New features?
New features. When I first heard the topic, I was like, stories? Really? Is somebody going to tell us an epic tale of something here? And who is that? And then after a while I understood that it had something to do with requirements, but it was very small, maybe just a sentence. And I saw before myself things like, how do you formalize a system in one sentence? Will that not leave a lot of things out for us to discover later? So I had to deep dive a bit into user stories, and this presentation will give you some insights of what I've picked up from that. Let me just introduce myself. My name is Marcus Hammarberg. This is my cartoon version. I work for this place, Aptitude. I have one wife, 2 hobbies, 3 kids. I'm a programmer. I've been programming since 1998, mainly on the Microsoft stack and mainly in the web corner of that stack. The last 8 or 9 years I've been more and more interested in how you work effectively together using agile methods such as Scrum and Kanban. Shameless plug for a book that I'm writing coming out very soon. The reason for me doing these presentations are that I'm soon to move abroad, and I've done a couple of presentations that I've done many times, so I thought I'll bury them and never talk about them again, just like my idol Jerry Seinfeld did with his jokes, no other relation. We'll record all of these, so you can find them at this address afterwards if you want to. And if anybody is wondering, I'm moving to Indonesia, working for the Salvation Army there. And I'm moving as soon as possible. We're waiting for a work permit. Burndown, who knows about Burndown? It's a small city of 7 million inhabitants, and we'll be working at the hospital there. So. Okay, back to the story at hand, which is user stories. So there's a guy called Michael Cohn. He's written the reference work about user stories called Userstories Applied. If you haven't read it, I still recommend it. It's pretty old actually in our terms, but it's also pretty good. So you should read it. A lot of the things that I will be talking about today is based on what he has written, and also I've added in some of my own experiences using specification by example, for example. The book describes user stories in an interesting way. It describes it as a promise of a conversation that we will have later. Something that we will talk more about. And further, it's a written description that we can use for planning and estimating. A little placeholder for a feature that we yet have to discuss. And the real details of the feature, the real details of the requirement will be fleshed out in the conversations that we're going to have. And a great way to document these conversations is actually using tests in some way. So in effect, we're having tests, we'll talk about those tests in a while, that actually make sure that you and I have understood the feature in the same way. One of the great important aspects of user stories that I like is that they talk about what the system should do without mentioning how it should be done. So it's all about user business functionality, and that's why it's called a user story, something that the user will benefit from. In fact, you could go so far as to say that the user story is not the requirement. Many big organizations where I worked have the requirements in some other form. They have maybe business rule documents some other way, some other place. We still use user stories though, and that was more like a delivery mechanism. So we had user story that was part of the requirements. It was not the complete requirement, it was part of a requirement, and we used that to be able to work in an iterative, incremental fashion. Alright, so what's good about user story? How come that it's been so spread and so loved? In fact, it's starting to be a bit bashed also, which is the natural flow of things, right? People starting to bash it now when it's old. But it's more or less the de facto standard for agile requirements. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that as a developer, I often complain about getting the requirements too late, when in fact they are often written too early. Because requirements, they rot, right? They have a best before date. For the non-speaking, and this is best before on a milk package. Don't ever try to drink it one day after. They burn that into the box, right? But if you think about it, if I write a requirement document today and I just put it here and leave it for 6 months, who would dare pick it up and just start working on it? We don't, right? Because things change in our environment. And the good thing about the user story that doesn't specify the details of the requirement, it's just a conversation that we will have later, is that they allow us to wait to make decisions to later in the process. At the moment where we know more about the things that we're going to build, just before we start to work with it. And that ties in nicely with the lean thinking of just in time, right? The opposite of just in time is just in case. So if I write a lot of stuff just in case, then they will rot and they will not be correct when I start to work with it. Just in time helps me to choose path right when I need it. So I told you that the user story should be short. So what is enough then? When is the glass filled to the right level? There's a couple of ways to decide that. And one of the best I've found actually is to use a small sticky to write them on. Because that then then you are physically limited in how much you can write on it if you use an ordinary pen. Or if you use a sticker this big, then you will fit a lot of text on it, right? There's another little tip and a little template that a lot of people use that helps us to write small, short stories that focus on the right things. And it's this template: as a role, I want this feature so that benefit. The best part of this is that last sentence. In fact, that's so important that some people recommend us to write that first. Why is that important then? Well, that's the reason for us doing this at all. If we go back to this, it's really easy to leave that part out, because it starts to ask some really hard questions. And most of the documents, requirement document that I've read doesn't contain that. But with that in place, we can start to reason about this in another way, because we know why we need this. So this is the reason for this feature to exist. This is the person that needs it, and he wants this. So let's take an example. In order to keep track of my savings as a saver in the bank, I want a simple overview of all my savings accounts. Alright, so the reason for me having this is that I want to keep track of my savings. I want to track them. Maybe we should use some kind of graphical interface then. Should this be a list? Should this be a report? We can have all of these discussions based on that we know that the main reason for this user story is for me to keep track of it. And here, down below here, they're talking about a simple overview that also gives us some kind of information around that. In order to protect my economical status as a user of the bank, I want to log in using Twitter. Alright, so do you feel safe with that? Yeah, that's safe enough, maybe, and we can start to discuss that. Do we really have to say just Twitter? Maybe we should say something else. You know about these little electronic devices that we send out to people. Maybe that's a bit more safe, I don't know. But as you can see, there's a lot of questions that can be raised when you see a story like this, and that's just as it should. This should not specify the complete requirement. We want to flesh that out later. All right. You need, when I wrote this the first time, it was very popular to have these what pictures. So what is it that is so great about the user story then? Well, the first thing that is great about the user story is that it forces us to talk to each other. It forces verbal communication, because when I get one of those user stories, I can immediately understand that I need to ask somebody about this. I cannot just start coding with this. So if I got that from Matthias, I probably need to go to Matthias and ask, all right, so what do you really mean? How do you see this formalized itself? And that's great, because in written documentation it's so easy to misunderstand each other. Just think about the reason for us creating a smiley, for example. That's just because we wanted to indicate that the last sentence was a joke, right? And when we talk to each other and we sit down, especially if we're more than two people, we have a much wider communication span. So we talk with each other, we learn from each other in that conversation, and we have a much more dynamic communication, right? Another great thing about the user story is that everybody understands them. Even a non-techie can understand a user story. Even a techie can understand a user story. Maybe even our users could understand the user story. In fact, that could be a really good way of writing them, to make sure that they actually understand them. Then we start to use the words that they use for the things in our story. It doesn't mean that you need to write the user story for this guy, though. So you don't have to explain everything from the universe existence up till now. You can assume some domain knowledge, for example, that you know what certain objects, certain things are. But you can write them in a very ordinary fashion. A user story is small, and we want it small in order to have them easy to manage. We'll talk about that later when we talk about estimation and planning. So to get them in the right size, we need to break bigger requirements down. And then you start to ask yourself, so what's big enough then? What's too small? What's too big? Well, that's not really easy to answer, because that will differ from different situations and different companies and different teams. But if you get them small, you want in the right size, they are perfect for iterative and incremental delivery. That is, we want to be able to deliver some value with each user story. And this is one place where I see many teams trip up. So let me talk about what I mean with that. We want the user story to be a slice of the system, but we want the slice to be on the right axis, right? So we want the slice to go this way. This is a very stereotypical architecture of a system. But we want some of the user interface, some of the business logic, and some of the database in each user story. The opposite of this would be delivering it like this. What is that I've just drawn over there? That's a mock-up of the entire user interface. It's good, it can be very useful, but it's not done. So we don't know when we're done, and this haven't helped us one single bit, because we cannot say how much is left. We just know that the user interface is mocked out now. And of course you can do that in other places. I've done this many times. Let's build the data access layer first, so we know that that's in place before we start with the rest of it. But that's also bad, because now we don't know how much is left. Doing this, we at least know that this little function is actually done now. And this might be something super simple. It might be just searching and getting just the first name in the result list. Yeah, but this is not complete, no? But it's done, right? That works. That's perfectly fine. I just spent half a year at a big Swedish internet site, and we delivered user stories like this. The first one was logging in, so they redid their whole site to be more responsive. And the first user story was log in, It took them about 1 day to do, and you logged in, and the text said you're logged in. That's everything they did. So it took them 2 days, actually, and then we released it. Was it useful? You could use it, but it wasn't very useful. But it was in production, so it was completed. They didn't have to redo that. And by taking that small part all the way into production, we got to practice to put it out in production. We had to think about what will we run this on. Can it run on the same hardware we have today? Will it run somewhere different? So a lot of questions that was pretty easy to answer with that little small feature, rather than if we had built the entire system. And then we had that one, and we added another slice of the system, and another one, and another one, and another one. Small items. The smaller, the better. And now we have to go past this animation stuff again. So when they are small, we're back to why is Userstories great. Well, they encourage us to wait with the details, as we talked about later. So we don't have to flesh out all the details. And that's really good for planning. Have you heard the term rolling wave planning? As I understand it, it talks about the things that are way in the future, way out to sea. That can be big stuff. Maybe that we need a whole new system. That's all right, because it's way in the future. We can still talk about it, building this new system or this new system. What would be beneficial for us? But the closer to shore we come, the closer the wave is, the smaller, the more fine-grained we want our requirements. So maybe then we start, all right, let's do that system, to break that down into sub-features, and then for each feature we break that down, and then we break it down further into user stories, which is maybe even part of the feature. And we start delivering those small parts. That's great, because we can do a couple of them and then say, well, this is enough. Now we probably need to take a look at that system. This is quite enough. We can roll with this right now. Another good thing about Userstory is that it acknowledges the fact that we don't know what we want. We don't know that, the user don't know that, nobody does actually. In order to get to know that, we need to cooperate. And this is one of the reasons behind Lean Startup. If you heard about Lean Startup, they are all about experiments. So they even put out 2 versions of the same feature. I heard about a company called it's a Google Analytics competitor. Probably come back to me in a while. Sorry. They did the Obama site for when he was first elected, and they put out 4 different versions on join us or something like that. You enter your email address, and then you get a message from them every week on how things are going. And a certain color on the button with a certain picture. There was a picture of a family with the blue color on the button. That was 34% better than having a picture of Obama with a red button. Why? Well, nobody knew. It was just, they measured it, it was 34% better. It was crazy. So, the follow-up question to this is, do we dare to be data-driven? Another much more local experience that I've had is that we put out 2 versions of a registration form. One with some kind of CAPTCHA, you know about CAPTCHA, these squiggly, we all hate them. So we had that turned on, and we had it turned off on the other one, and we only did that because we knew that it will be turned off, then it was much better. So we just wanted to test the technology of actually how to A/B testing, as this is known as. However, the CAPTCHA was better. Over the course of a week, it converted. We have 6% more registrations for this one, which was about 800 people. That's a significant difference, right? But we still went without CAPTCHA because we knew that this is much better, right? So I think this is, if I'm going to do some kind of trend analytics, this is something that people who dare be data-driven, who dare believe the data, they will actually have an advantage here. And in order to do so, you have to have small features that you can deliver often. Because you can't do that with your whole system, and then you can't roll out a new standard system and every new feature is one way because you thought that was right, and then you have to do it all the other way. You have to be able to switch small features. User story fits that perfectly, and it acknowledges the fact that we don't know what we want until it's done. Sadly. Let's get a little more practical and talk about how to write a good user story. Michael Cohn taught us an acronym called INVEST that talks about user stories being independent. This is quite hard, but it's also very useful. That means that we want this user story to be independent of this one. And a great litmus test for that is, does it matter which order I perform these two in? Can I do this one before this one? This gives us more flexibility in how we plan. So, this will fit. Yeah, but you need to do that one before. And if you do that one, you need to do that one. And you get a whole chain of that. You want to avoid that as much as possible. Negotiable just talks about that it is still out for grabs on how we're going to realize this user story. What I've been talking a lot about up to now. You want it to give some user or customer value, and no, the system is not the user. As a system, I want to. Try to find the value of for the user, for some user. You want to be able to estimate, and we'll talk a lot more about estimation in just a moment, how big this user story is. That can be done relatively, so is it bigger than this one, for example? That's much easier to say, but still you want to have some kind of hunch about that. You want to keep it small. I've talked a lot about that, but I cannot underline it enough. You want it to be as small as possible, in fact. And finally, you want to be able to test it. And a really good way of making sure that we understood it the same way is actually to write down a couple of tests for this. I often ask, when I've written a user story, I ask two questions. The first one is, how do I know when I'm done with this? That triggers a lot of follow-up questions that's really interesting. How would I know that this is complete? And a variant of that question is, how will we test this? What kind of tests will we run? And just writing those down as a bullet list will actually flesh out a lot of details about the story that you didn't think about earlier. When I first learned about user stories, and when I seen this from other people also, is that I worked at a big bank. They were using RUP. And one of the requirements guy came to me and he said, all right, so here's my requirement document, so now I just write this into user stories now. And I was like, yeah, but that's not really what user stories is for. Because you don't sit down at your bench and like, all right, let's write 500 user stories now. You start out from something big, an ID maybe, and you break that down into smaller and smaller pieces, as we talked about in rolling way planning, and you do that in an iterative fashion. So you might go back. I'll talk about something called impact mapping in a while, and that's really useful to actually give you some kind of overview on how you can approach a bigger area. One way of writing your user stories is think about this feature. If you end up with a user story that it's too big, maybe it will be used differently by different roles in the system. That's one way of splitting your user stories up. A really good tip is to start with a goal. Just writing that part of a user story is really a good way to flesh out what are we after in this user story. And as I said, you want to have a slate of this. Oh my God, that cake looks so disgusting. You want it to be just a thin slice of the system. And before anybody says it, it can be done. You can slice up the system. You can slice up your requirements. In fact, Michael Cohn, he has a challenge that since he wrote the book, which was in 2006 or something like that, 2007, he has a challenge that for people to send him a user story that he cannot divide further. So if you can send him an undividable user story, he will give you money. Nobody has gotten any money yet. So a good thing to think about is to write stuff that can to avoid processes and flows that never ends. For example, I have to read from the sheeting notes here. As a banking customer, I want to control my account to see in and output. That's never done, it never starts, it just a continued flow. As a banking customer, I want to see my account status to know what happened. That's a closed story that has a start and a stop. So that's one thing to think about. There might be limitations. This need to answer within these kind of limits. Or this can work only in Chrome, for example. Those things can be good to note down, maybe on the flip side of your card as well, so you know that if you have some limitations. We want to avoid describing the UI of our system. We're describing business functionality. This sounds easy, like a no-brainer, but it's really something that many people get tripped up on, actually. And in my experience, especially if you have a system already, many users of the system actually understand their business through the system. And in order to understand that, you can just ask them, how do you go about registering a new customer? Well, I search for his first name, so I enter that in that button, and I click on that button, and then I get a list, and I pick from the list, and that's not the business functionality, right? That's how the system is built. That's how it looks. So you have to probe that a bit and challenge them. So, well, you just described the system for me, but can we step back one bit and talk about the business functionality, the business rules here? In my experience, most people have a hard time doing that, actually. A lot of these recommendations is actually summed up in this template that I find quite useful, especially if you start with that one and don't leave that out. I see too many, and also be mindful of what you're writing. As a trader, I want to trade, right? Doesn't say much, right? This is in fact a 3-hour presentation where I go a bit slower, and we also do some practical exercises. But this is a really good exercise that I can, and it's easy to describe as well. Take a feature that you're going to talk about, maybe something big that are many user stories, which it often is, and then you divide your group into 2 or 3, how many you are, so you get 3 or 4 people in each team, and you write user stories separately. For maybe 20 minutes, you meet back and discuss what you have learned and how you wrote it. This will give you a lot of feedback and a lot of information. You thought like that. Okay, good. That's a really good way of getting a lot of information about the feature you're going to build. Gathering user stories is sadly like this. You don't just go and pick them up. You have to have some kind of way of doing that in workshops like we just talked about. If you do that, please include all the competencies needed in order to spec this out, right? If we're only developers in the team doing the user stories, I promise you that the user stories will be developer-centric. If it's only testers, you can imagine. You want somebody to think about the business requirement, the business needs. Somebody to think about how this will be developed. Maybe we have features that already support this. Maybe if we could do it in this way instead, we will gain a lot of implementation time. And somebody to think about how that will be testable. It might be the same person, but I've rarely seen that person in one.
Business.
Yeah, of course. In my case, this was written for a certain customer, sorry, but that could as well be. So these are just examples. Business is one. Operation operations. Why not include operations in here? So all the people that are needed to complete this task that might be interested are interesting. Just like a cross-functional team, right? The people needed to solve the task at hand. So by all means, the customer. It's so rare for us to actually meet the real customer. That still amazes me. That the actual user of the system. It would be great to have them in there.
Marcus?
Yeah.
Can you back up? You have written user stories and scenarios.
Yeah, that's because I borrowed that. Sorry. So scenarios in this way is one way to document your tests.
Okay.
Specification by example like. Another thing that I'm just going to mention, because it's a whole topic of its own, is something called user story mapping. That's a really good way of laying out your map of the system, and it works like this. On this top level, you see his yellow. This is Gary, by the way. On his top level items here, that's the big features that this system is going to have. If this was Outlook, it would be create new mail, send mail, read mail, create new event, and so forth. Within those, you have tasks that might be suitable for user stories, and they can often be broken down further, maybe. Impact mapping. That's another great technique of doing this. It's similar, but it starts out by answering why are we here? What's the vision for the thing that we're doing right now? This is a Formula 1 team, they want to win the World Cup, right? Then you ask yourself, who can help us with this? And you do this in a mind map fashion. So you have a big mind map on the wall, and then you start with the why. So that might be, we want to have more than 1 million users. All right, who can help us reach that goal? Well, advertisers, other customers, how will they help us do that? In this case, it's easy, right? So he can drive the car faster. We train him so he can drive the car faster. He will help us to trim the car into being a faster car. So what do we need to build to support this? And on this level, we have the software features that could be realized as user stories. If we do that, we have a nice traceability back to the goal. So the so what is pretty easy to find out here. The part of why are we doing this. So check out impact mapping. It's a really powerful tool. Not that hard to get started with, but it raises some pretty hard questions. So it's hard to be proficient in, but it's not that hard to get started with. Let's talk a little bit about estimating as well. Human beings, we are pretty bad at estimating things exactly. So this is a really hard question, right? How big is that rock? Well, what do you mean in kilos? How big is that photo? That's a really hard question to answer. But this is much easier if you're not a wise ass and say that I have zoomed into that one. I don't know, because we can say things like, well, that looks half the size of that one, roughly. So relative measurements is much easier to give than exact measurements, right? Probably from the Stone Age, right? That mammoth looks double the size of this mammoth. Let's kill that one, or let's run away. So one way of that's proven very successful and people like is to use something called story points, which is just arbitrary points that you can assign to a story. So let's say that this story is 2. Well, this is about double the size, so let's call that 5, and so on and so forth. The good thing about this is that it's really easy to use to give relative measurements. The bad thing about this is that there are numbers. What happens with numbers? We start to calculate with them. So me as a manager will immediately say, so your team did 20 points the last sprint. That's great, because we have 3 teams. That's 60 points a sprint, and then you keep that going, and we're off to some really nasty places. And that's simply because we can count, we can make calculations with these. Because my team might call this user story 2, while Per's team might call the same user story 13. And if I move into Per's team, I may influence them into calling that 8 instead. So you cannot really tell. That's also why people have stopped using user stories and instead just call them small, medium and large. I'll show you a couple of really good estimation techniques that I've used that are really fast as well. The first one is planning poker. Everybody use that? So it's a real simple exercise. You just discuss the story at hand, and then you vote by showing your card and how big is this compared to the other things that we have done. The important thing here is, of course, that when you're in disagreement, you should discuss this. So these are all given different numbers, and they are widely different. So this guy probably means something else than she does, right? And that's the secret. It's not about the numbers, really. You don't want to have number 3. That's not very important. That we have discussed it and we have fleshed it out, or in order for us to agree that it's a 5. That's the important part. If you're in a hurry, you can do a much simpler exercise that I found very useful, in fact, and that you take your whole stack of user stories, if you have a bunch of them, and you take one. Which one it doesn't matter, and just put it down on the table. Then you take the next one and say, all right, is this bigger or smaller? And that's really easy to answer. Often you get the "Are you stupid?" question back, because it's widely bigger or widely smaller. But if you do that with every user story, you can start to put them in a line like this, right? So you get them ordered from smallest to large. And then you can just go through the story and say, you know what, these, we call them small, medium, large, XL, and the XLs, we don't like them, so let's break that down further. That's a simple exercise to estimate a big bunch of user stories quickly. We used to do this in my Scrum team for the backlog that was left for us after every sprint. And of course we put about 10 minutes into that after every sprint, and we got better and better for each iteration. Another thing, another exercise that I've been using is called Goldilocks, and that's from Goldilocks and the Three Bears, the children's tale. And that's about the same thing. You say, okay, so this is just right. You have to define what just right is then. Maybe that's what we can do in a week. That's just right. What about this? Well, it's too big, right? Let's put it in that pile. And this one, that's too small. This is just right, and then you put them in different piles. And then you try to merge the ones in this too small pile, and then you try to split the ones in the too big pile until it's all the same size. So that's a bit like turning the tables, right? You instead change your work to fit your shape. For all of these, the main thing is the discussions. This is where we flesh out. That's why I still do estimates, in fact, because there's a no estimates movement going on right now. Have you heard about that? That's really interesting. Take a look at that, because estimate, in fact, if you think about it, nobody have asked us for an estimate of our customers. I promise you that no customer, no end user has ever called your company up and thanked you for the great estimate that you get. It's not the deliverable. It's something that we need.
But if you promise to deliver something and you don't, then you hear about it.
Yeah, but still not the estimate, just the feature.
Okay.
So this is a quote that I've tweaked. I think it's from Roosevelt or no, Eisenhower. So he talks about plans. Estimates the actual number 13 or 56, that's not important. But doing the estimate exercise, coming up with that number, that could be very useful actually, because that's when we're fleshing out details in order to decide if this is 13 or 56. The actual number, I don't know. Let's go really fast through planning. I don't think this is so interesting, but when you plan, you have you balance three things against each other: time, the date when we want to deliver, the resources, the number of hours we have to our disposal, the people, the hardware, the money for it, and what we're going to do. In fact, there's a fourth one called quality, but we don't want to mess with that because bad quality comes back and bites us later. So if we now have gone through so much work to create our user stories in small items that we can deliver in an independent order, we have actually set ourselves up for a great place to do planning. And this is shown in how you do sprint planning. I often start with, when do we want to be done? And we put down a date and a hour. So all right, so we want to be done the 12th December, 9 o'clock. Great. Who are with us this sprint? How many hours do we have to our disposal up to that point, or how many, whatever? This is old school sprint planning. And now we can pick features. And this is really hard, so we can fill this up. This is really hard to do if we have big features. If we have small features, it's much easier. And you, of course, know this. If we have done this, we can create a Burndown chart that over time shows how we're doing against an idealized version. So we can actually start to say, all right, we're lagging behind here, maybe we should do something about that. If you're doing Kanban and you have a continuous flow, you don't need stuff like this because that will be shown right on your board. And a few words on testing as well. When is the story done? That's a really important question to ask yourself, and it also shows how much of your process you take into consideration. The story is not done, in fact, until it's used. It's in production and being used. That's when it's done. It might, in fact, even then it might create more work for us, but that probably is another story. So we want to include testing in our user stories, and as I told you a couple of times already, a really good way is actually to have the testing perspective represented when you write user stories, and ask yourself, how do I know when this is done? How will we test this, and things like that. Because if you're doing user stories and deliver incremental and iterative or in an agile way, you turn the tables a bit. The goal in agile testing is not to find bugs, it's actually to not introduce bugs in the first place. Bugs are much cheaper to fix when we're talking about them, right, than when a system is completed. And a real simple tip about this, if you want to know more about this, check out specification by example. Next, if you go to our recording site for these talks, I did a talk on specification by example a couple of days ago. It's a great way to doing that, to make this happen. But a really good way is actually to write the test you're going to perform before you start coding. I heard somebody describe, it was a woman called Liz Keogh. She described how BDD, behavior-driven development, which is another name for specification by example, in this manner. She said, I'm a developer. I hate testers. They come in afterwards and they find problems in my product. They find problems in the code I wrote. So I found a great way to solve that. I put the testers on the other side. I put them before I started coding. And now they have to tell me, well, this is what I'm going to test. All right, I can fix this. And that's actually a really nice trick, right? Think about testing before you start to code, and then you set yourself up in a much nicer way. And also, we get the definition of what done means by just by using this way of working. So, summing up, a user story is a small written description, a promise of a conversation that we will have later. It's not the detailed requirements, that will be fleshed out in our conversation. A great way to document that is to write down the tests we're going to do, to make sure that we are understanding each other in the same way. They are excellent for doing estimates and planning in an agile project because they encourage us doing iterative and incremental delivery. And that was, in fact, all I had. On the way out, could you please give me some feedback with a small magnetic stuff on just close to the door? And you will find the recorded version of this talk here in a couple of days when we have crunched through the big file that is created from this. Thank you so much. We'll be hanging around out here if you want to ask or talk with me or somebody else in here. Thank you.